Hi class, this is Gemma and Andaya again with just a little bit of information for you in regards to Introduction to Counseling. So in the last video we talked about setting the psychological stage before actually entering into a interview or counseling session. In this video I intended to talk to you about actually being engaged in the counseling process, but after some further consideration, I thought that maybe even giving you some background on what trauma does to the brain and to the body and to memory processes in the brain, I thought that that was really fundamental information that is crucial for you to understand prior to even going into counseling. So we'll start there today. Okay, so in the 1990s, there was this really big, probably the largest study ever done in regards to measuring the negative effects of traumatic experiences. So it's called the Adverse Childhood Events, ACE. So people refer to it as the ACEs study. And this study's consisted of about 17,000 participants over time. Their medical records were reviewed and they measured the amount of behavioral health disorders, so that it can include mental health and substance abuse, as well as medical disorders. And then they correlated those numbers with the amounts of adverse childhood events, otherwise known as traumatic events, in childhood. And so these adverse childhood events could include, living in poverty, severe neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, living with somebody who was mentally ill and untreated. So the range of adverse childhood events was very wide. And so what this study found was pretty monumental to the mental health field and to the medical field. It found that the more number of adverse childhood events an individual has, the more number of mental health, substance abuse, and or medical disorders are present in that individual later on in adulthood. Okay, so I give you this study so that you understand the impact of adverse childhood events or traumatic events, even in adulthood. So what is actually happening to the brain when it is affected negatively by such events? So in order to describe that, I have to give you a description of the basic functions of the brain. And so in order to do so, I'm going to reference Dr. Dan Siegel. He came up with this model of the brain in which you can use your hand. So you just tuck in your thumb here and then you wrap your fingers around the thumb. And so this would the wrist would be like your spinal cord. This would be the brain stem. This would be like the midbrain, and then this part is like right here, right the front of the brain. Dan Siegel refers to 5 different parts of the brain, but in order to make this really layman's terms so that you can take this information and describe it to your kids, or you can describe it to your clients, or just to be able to better understand it, I'm only going to break it down into 3 basic parts, and I'm not going to call it by their medical names. I'm just going to refer to this as part 1, part 2, and then this wrapping around is part 3. Other names, which I find very helpful to remember, is like reptilian brain, mammalian brain, and then the frontal cortex or neocortex. And I'll describe to you these parts. So let's start with part 1. So this part of the brain stem, is responsible for those functions in the body that you don't even have to think about, but they are always happening to keep you alive, such as your heart beating, your digestive tract, your reproductive system, your immune system, your central nervous system, your endocrine system, respiratory system, all of these things that the body does in order to keep you alive on a day-to-day basis, this part of the brain is responsible for. The reason I call it the reptilian brain, or other people call it the reptilian brain, is because it's the most oldest part of the brain. And if you think about reptiles, what do, right? They're cold, they go into the sun. They're hot, they go into the shade. They eat, they sleep, they reproduce, very basic functions. So the next part of the brain is part 2, or the mammalian brain. And so over the years, you can think of this part of the brain being the oldest, and then as we evolved, another outer layer of that brainstem became present in mammals. And what that part of the brain is responsible for is memory, for one, and also for basic human emotions. And I say basic human emotions such as anger, jealousy, love, attachment. These emotions, although some of them are uncomfortable, they're all necessary for the survival and reproduction of the human race. And so they're embedded deep in us in order so that we can protect our kin, protect our belongings, protect our tribe, to find a support system to be able to accomplish more. So this part of the brain is responsible for these emotions as well as memory. So why memory? Why is it part of a survival? Well, as mammals, we have the capacity to remember, if you eat that green plant, you're going to have serious diarrhea and you're going to die. So don't eat that green plant, right? Or maybe the memory is you felt really safe around these people, be around these people more, associate with them more, build something with them. And so those are the functions of this part of the brain. So memory as well as basic human emotions. Now, over the years, as we continue to develop, our brain has developed this outer layer, the frontal cortex or neocortex. It's referred to in different ways. So this part of the brain is what differentiates us humans from other mammals. And this part of the brain is responsible for thinking about the future, thinking about consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for creativity, and analyzing situations, analyzing ourselves. It's responsible for higher order human emotions. So whereas the mid part of the brain, that mammalian part of the brain, was responsible for basic emotions, this outer part of the brain is responsible for empathy, compassion, altruism, and so just to name a few functions of that part of the brain. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of the brain, let's talk about what happens to it during a traumatic event and post a traumatic event. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard the expression, she flipped her lid or he flipped his lid, right? So you can literally think of that expression being very accurate as to what happens in the brain. The frontal lobe, which is responsible for logic and reason and thinking about the consequences, thinking about the future, analyzing, that part of the brain is no longer in communication with the emotional or memory part of the brain, or with that part of the brain that takes care of all those physiological functions. So with this no longer communicating with this, what happens under a traumatic event is these parts of the brain, the older, more established parts of the brain, start to take over. And that's what cues the body and the brain like, watch out, look at the predator, try to read his or her every move, try to understand what's happening. You have to either fight, or you have to run away, or you have to drop dead and play possum and play dead. And so these parts of the brain take over, and this part of the brain is no longer accessible to us through trauma. Okay? Obviously, you can't stay in that traumatic event forever. Well, I guess you could if you're being held captive in one way or another, but that's not what we're referring to here. So once you're outside of that traumatic event, this lid can slowly start to come back down as you start to feel safe again, right? And that's what counseling is for, is we try to create a safe, non-judgmental, empathetic environment for our clients in order for them to be able to fully integrate their brain and be able to communicate with all parts of their brain and feel their bodies and have more control over their bodies, right? So that's essentially, when you boil down trauma-informed care, that's what it is. No matter what the theoretical lens, whether it's a CBT approach or humanistic or an EMDR, whatever it is, the goal essentially, when we boil it down, is to help integrate the brain so that the thought process is in line with the emotions and is in line with the physical body's response, so that everything is working in unison. I definitely feel like I missed something, so let me review my notes real quick. Okay. Unfortunately, what happens when something traumatic happens and that lid is flipped? For some reason, that traumatic memory is not integrated into the long-term memory fully processed, and so it becomes disintegrated. Part of it goes into the part of the brain that's responsible for timekeeping, the other part into the emotional part, the other part into the frontal lobe, the other part in the physiological part, and so some of it is stored in the body. And so because the traumatic memory is disintegrated or broken up, it is not processed fully. And so in trauma work, that's the secondary goal, is to help create a cohesive timeline of the event that includes the emotional, the negative cognitions about the self or about the world that were developed because of this negative traumatic event, in order to fully process that memory and restore it fully and properly this time, and be able to have more mental space to be able to put that energy somewhere else. So the last two things I want to leave you with is, we talked about integration of the brain being the goal of trauma-informed care. So that type of integration is vertical integration, so top to bottom or bottom to top. So some approaches, for example, I'm a yoga instructor, and so I practice a lot of like mindfulness, meditation, yoga, and I incorporate that into therapy. And so my approaches tend to be a little bit more bottom up, meaning that I target the physiological responses and I try to get those down to a manageable level, and then we engage and see where are we holding our emotions, what are those emotions, let's put a label on them, and then we talk about more cognitive talk therapy. But sometimes therapy isn't that way, and other people use different approaches, and so maybe they're using a more cognitive therapy where you're talking about, you're pinpointing the irrational thoughts and the irrational beliefs about the world, and then you identify what emotions those make you feel, and maybe you incorporate a little bit of like Gestalt therapy and you talk about where do you feel that in the body. And so there's different ways for this vertical integration to occur. There isn't just one right way. Although there is a lot of research right now supporting mindfulness, supporting biofeedback in regards to integrating the brain. Definitely meditation and yoga are up there as far as the newest research. But there's this horizontal integration of the brain that I'm recently learning about. So if I'm not describing it effectively, it could be because I'm still processing this information. So this horizontal integration of the brain is integrating the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. So the left side of the brain, the left hemisphere, is responsible more so for very logical thinking, right? So very cause and effect, linear type of thinking. Whereas the right side of the brain is more so paying attention to what is not in the conscious awareness. It's almost like paying attention to the implicit self. So what does that mean? What would that look like? So using the right part of the brain, it might look like I'm having a conversation with someone, And I am observing as I'm talking to them. So what I'm saying is using the left part of my brain, right? But observing myself, like my facial expression is changing. I'm getting a little bit worked up as I'm talking to this person. I'm noticing that I'm kind of starting to sweat and have this physiological response. So that like almost meta awareness about myself, that is actually using the right part of my brain. Noticing the tone of my voice, noticing my facial expressions, noticing my body language, maybe it changes. Those are all using the right part of the brain. Whereas what I'm logically trying to say to you, that's using the left part of my brain. So we also not only want to work with vertical integration of the brain, top, bottom, up, but also a horizontal integration where we're looking at the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And so the one thing that the literature is showing right now is very effective for that right hemisphere of the brain is meditation practices help build that implicit self and be able to build that self-awareness. And as a side note, just because I am a big promoter of mindfulness, is that mindfulness, a huge study has come out that says that mindfulness decreases the risk of inflammatory diseases. So inflammatory diseases could be skin conditions or cardiovascular or, like fibromyalgia, chronic migraines, things of that sort. Inflammatory diseases can be warded off by the practice of mindfulness, whereas just the opposite, chronic stress, meaning stress day in, day out without periods in between to repose and kind of calm down and catch ourselves, that increases the likelihood of inflammatory diseases. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. I definitely covered a lot of ground in 17 minutes, so feel free to pause and replay as much as you need to. Until next time, I hope that was helpful to you. And if you ever have any questions or comments, my name is Gemma Andaya. You can find me on the internet, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. All right, take care.